The InfoScope land management system allows you to effectively automate and address areas such as tenement compliance, stakeholder engagement, ground disturbance, environmental obligations, native title, cultural heritage and land access. Talk to us today about a comprehensive solution catered to your operations.
Hello, I'm Wendy Tyrrell, Executive Director of the Development Partner Institute. Really delighted to welcome you to this important conversation about responsible sourcing. Firstly, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Aboriginal custodians of this land on which I stand, the Jarrawa and Earable peoples, and their elders past and present. I acknowledge and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship with the land, and I extend that to Indigenous people across the world. Responsible sourcing of materials is important right across the value chain of mining. So if you're listening as an investor or a mining company, there's more and more interest from people who are purchasing computers, who are purchasing cars, to understand where their materials come from and to ensure that they're responsibly sourced. So today's conversation brings a range of perspectives, important perspectives, to that discussion of responsible sourcing. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Sheila, Khama, Joan Krajewski, and Lana. So I'm going to start by asking to each of you, tell me what brings you to this discussion on responsible sourcing? Why are you passionate about this topic? So Sheila, Joan, and then Lana.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy, and it's lovely to meet Joan and Lana. I come from mining country. In my place of birth, Botswana, the country is nothing really without diamond mining. And I had been privileged to see what mining can do for people, put me through school. And what pleases me is that I was not, for my generation, the exception, I'm the rule. But it wasn't until I left Botswana and left DBS, where I worked for 13 years, and traveled to West Africa, to the country of Liberia, and saw there the contrast after the civil war, and to see how in that country, the lack of responsible mining had been the exact antithesis of what I had experienced, that I realized that the future of mining wasn't so much in the good mining does, but the risk of the bad that mining does in some parts of the world to the entire industry, that I knew that it was important for what I had experienced not to be the exception, but instead to be the universal experience, or at least commonly accepted. And this is what, for me, is important about mining, and this is what keeps me interested in mining, and particularly the question of responsible sourcing, because it was due to conflict and the procurement irresponsibly of diamonds to fund illicit trade in Liberia that those people suffered. And so this is, for me, what is so critical, that we strike the right balance.
Thanks, Sheila. Wonderful introductory remarks. So from Botswana now to Washington State in the US, Joan.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here with this great panel and diverse panel. Thank you so much, Wendy. So my journey with responsible sourcing began with visits to contract manufacturers in China. Now, at the time, and still today, this is a highly competitive business with really narrow margins. And we were told by factory managers that we couldn't make a difference when it came to environmental, human rights, health and safety, and living condition issues due to the competitive nature of the businesses. But we decided to go forward and try anyway. And the results were nothing short of astounding. We were able to reduce employee turnover from heights of 70+% annually to some factories below 5% annually. This led to reduced costs in terms of retention, recruitment, and training. And that led to higher quality in terms of our products. And there was also an employee morale element. We ended up winning awards for our programs. This led to a huge sense of pride across the company. There was absolutely nothing so heartwarming as having, our employees be able to walk out on the line and have a worker come to them and personally thank them for making their lives better. This was really meaningful to these employees. It made a world of difference. And even having their children come to them in their home and say to them, their parents, how proud they were of the work that they had done. So this led our journey, and it also inspired us to look up further in our supply chain to the origination of materials. And mining is certainly very important in that respect.
Thanks so much, Joan. And now Lana in Canada, in Western
Good morning,
Canada.
everyone. I'm calling in from Campbell River today, where I work and live. And I would just like to acknowledge that I am calling in from the traditional territories of the Wiwe-Kai, the Wiwe-Khama, and the Kwakwa First Nations. What an honor to be here with such an incredible panel. And so I really am enjoying meeting and hearing from Sheila and Joan this morning. I think what drives me and what continues for me to move into this arena and to talk with some expertise is sort of the voice of Indigenous people. And really, when we talk about responsible sourcing, I think, there are some companies that are starting to move into this direction in Canada, where they have a large amount of local procurement taking place, local people hired. And when I speak of local, I speak of Indigenous people. And I think maybe they haven't called it responsible sourcing, but we seem to give these tags, these different monikers to different things to make us appear better. So I guess in all of this, I would want to ensure that we hear the voices of Indigenous people so that they're brought into the conversation and that they can help define what responsible truly means. And I say that because I look at ESG, and yesterday I listened to a very interesting webinar that DPI hosted, and it was talking to different Indigenous people from around the world about ESG and this new movement. And it's probably not brand new, but wondering how much of that really includes the voices of Indigenous people, so that we can say that we truly are socially responsible. So I think to go forward, we definitely need to hear from local people in helping define what responsible looks like. And I think that there's a great future for everyone involved in terms of building wealth and helping us achieve our SDG goals. But until we're willing to have those conversations, it's pretty much one-sided. And that's my view.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lana. Three great introductory sets of remarks. Sheila and Lana, you each bring a unique and compelling perspective from both inside and outside the mining sector. For mining companies and investors listening here, tell us, what does responsible sourcing mean to you? Sheila first and then Lana.
Responsible sourcing means a lot of things, but the one that is top of mind is, for me, the concept of economic justice. And that is to say, a world in which companies, governments prosper, but they do so in a way that touches everybody's life positively. That we are a better society when everybody prospers. The notion of winner takes all, at least in my mind, has no place in future of mining and prosperity. But I underpin that with the notion of responsible leadership, because it's impossible to have economic justice in the absence of a leadership that recognizes and fosters that justice. And here I'm referring to leadership both in the political sense and in the corporate sense. And so when I think about this leadership, I see this leadership repositioning mining to be at the heart of economic justice, especially in communities that are, for better or for worse, vulnerable or in the fringes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sheila. Lana.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I alluded to it in my first answer on how we can be more responsible, and that is to bring in the voices of Indigenous people. In BC, where I'm from, we signed an act at the end of 2019, and that was the Free, Prior, and Informed Consent Act. And it was hailed and it was applauded, and Indigenous people in BC were quite happy with how we were being acknowledged. But I think at the same time, we continue to see things happening, which gives us pause to wonder, have we really come this far? And so, yes, I agree, it does take some political sense to lead this, but there is also being political. And if it's to gain votes or to make us feel that we're moving in the right direction, that's not enough. We actually have to do something. So I think the courage to move forward in this realm is for companies to begin to have those real conversations with communities. And I think it takes a courageous leader to be able to do that and to show that they're doing that, and to recognize and to respect the voices that they're hearing from the Indigenous communities. I think we're poised for that. And I think some companies have positioned themselves to become those companies, but I've yet to see it actually happening. And maybe what it requires now is for civil society, such as investors, to begin to want that to happen more, so that we can have those voices at the table, and those voices can begin to determine what responsible sourcing looks like.
Fantastic. Thank you. So a theme there around leadership and economic justice. Joan, you've recently stepped away from Microsoft after 14 years in senior sustainability roles. What are your top insights on responsible sourcing that you would share that come with the benefit of hindsight to help miners who are seeking to understand how consumer products companies are thinking about responsible sourcing and mining?
Well, to Lana's point, the world is poised for change, and the newer generations are speaking and speaking loudly. And consumer companies are fiercely competitive. And one area where we're really fiercely competitive on is attracting the best and the brightest. And those employees and job candidates come in armed with data and information. They know what their pay is going to be. They know what the benefits are going to be. They've done research on responsible sourcing, and they ask really tough questions on responsible sourcing. And they're going to hold the companies, and they do, their feet to the fire on these issues. And if we can't answer them appropriately with data and the right information, coming from the right place, then we are not going to get those candidates that are highly mobile and, and that we're all fighting for. And so the second point I want to make is, despite the fierce competition that I mentioned, this is one area where companies are willing to work together and collaborate and share data, not in violation of antitrust rules, of course, but to share data and to use technology to magnify that data and really go upstream and ensure that they're increasing the responsible sustainability of their supply chains. And technology, the third point, has evolved to the point where sourcing managers can now look at their desktops and really look at a part and be able to dive down using business intelligence to know exactly what mine that part is coming from. They can go all the way through the refiners up to the mining or areas, geopolitical areas, and also to the mines themselves. What does this mean? It means that a sourcing manager can elect to use another component or part that doesn't rely on a certain mine's output. It means that we can reach out to refiners and say, hey, I understand you're getting, you know, a material ore from this particular mine. Either don't source from that mine anymore, sequester it, or let's have a conversation with the mine owner to see if we can, you know, work this out and have some improvement in this particular area. So companies are listening to their employees. They're listening to outside organizations, activists, and experts on these issues. They're going to be increasingly important and increasingly accessible as the technology evolves.
It's fascinating to see competitive advantage and the way that you've drawn a thread between that and all the way through to the data and where those minerals are sourced from. That's fascinating. Sheila, turning to the mining sector then, what would you say are two highlights that you see in progressive companies doing well on responsible sourcing? And what can we do differently in the future?
Yeah, so I think progressive companies understand two fundamental issues. The one is that you are only as good as your people. And by your people here, I mean not just the workers, but the communities with whom you relate. So this ecosystem of your people is critical. And good mining companies understand the importance of managing those relationships, however intricate they may be. In the context particularly of employees, progressive mining companies know that universities and colleges teach people skills and they hire the best, but they know that corporations teach them values, the values that those corporations stand for, because those people become their champions. They become the face of the company. They become the embodiment of the company, and they make a very clear distinction between those. The second thing that progressive companies do is that they act with enlightened self-interest. And the emphasis here is on enlightenment. And enlightened self-interest means that you are progressive in your understanding that you will survive because of your capacity to understand progressively the environment in which you operate, whether it is the governance environment, whether it is the physical environment or the social environment, and they stay ahead of this. And companies that presume that they can drop their guard on those issues often find themselves on the defense. This is my experience.
Thanks, Sheila. And what can those companies do differently in the future?
My sense is that the world in which we live, in which information and technology makes information so readily available, is that those companies can and must move much faster than previously. In the past, it was the corporates that led the world. Now it is the individuals collectively using social media and accessing information that are now determining what the agenda in the boardroom is. The capacity of companies to understand that their agenda in the boardroom is now driven from outside is the single most important transformational moment for me that I think companies need to reckon with.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sheila. That's a great response. And for those listening, we can see the link from what Sheila has been speaking about and what Joan's speaking about, all the way down through the mining value chain. So over to you, Lana. What would you say 1 to 2 highlights from your experience that progressive companies are doing well and can do differently in the future?
I think definitely, and agreeing with Sheila, it comes down to people. And those are people that are willing to think outside the box and to find solutions and to find ways to reach out to communities so that communities can prosper, whether it's through training and employment or whether it's through procurement of their services. And that in itself starts to create a better relationship with the communities that might have a working relationship with the mine. So I can think of two particular examples in BC that have done very well. And I won't name those companies, but currently we have an area which I'm sure many mining people are familiar with, and that is the Golden Triangle. And in that particular instance, the Tahltan, who are the First Nations that in that is where the Golden Triangle is, have created a protocol so that any company that wants to explore, whether they're mineral explorers or seasoned mining companies, have a protocol to work through in terms of formulating an agreement with the Tahltan. And this has worked really well. So in essence, the Tahltan have put themselves in the driver's seat in terms of, if you want to do business, you have to learn to do business with us. And I think that to me is the beginning of responsible sourcing, is knowing that there is a lens over all the operations, how a company moves forward, that has to fit in with how the Tahltan want business to be done in their traditional territory. So that gives me hope that other communities will be able to maybe not mirror exactly the same way the Tahltan have put their agreement together, but certainly use that as an example of how operations, whether it's mineral exploration or mining, can continue or proceed in their traditional territories. Thinking outside the box is critical, and I think it's really important for companies to have the right people on the ground to work with Indigenous communities. And when I say on the ground, I mean in that particular mine, and not maybe at a corporate office. If a lot of the mining corporate offices are in Toronto, and so there is a great distance between a mine site in BC and a head office in Toronto. So if people in Toronto are tasked with building relationships with communities, it kind of just might not work as well as having someone locally located nearby that can have those day-to-day conversations with communities and help build those relationships. So really building a relationship is an ongoing process. It starts at the very beginning, at an early stage, and continues to work its way as the mine progresses through its life. So I think that thinking outside the box and certainly not being afraid, being courageous, are two really important things, but it is a people component, definitely.
Thanks very much, Lana. And so for Australian miners, we'd be talking about Melbourne and Sydney versus the regions in which mining is conducted, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, respecting people in the often remote regions in which people are operating. Joan, from your perspective, one or two highlights that you would see, and particularly how would you see mining and consumer products companies working differently together in the future?
Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge what Lana has said. I think it's really important that mining entities and also companies, to the extent that we engage on that level, do so in a way that's culturally and linguistically, geographically appropriate. I think it would really make the difference between a successful and a not so successful project. So it's absolutely key. So I want to underscore that point. From the consumer products company's perspective, obviously it's really difficult for us to actually relate on that level as much as we actually want to, and we want to support that mines do that. So one way in which we can do so, and also create a level playing field, so to speak, is to require that those interactions take place via standards, acknowledging that every project is and community is different. And those standards I think should be developed. I think mining companies and consumer companies should be involved in the development of those standards so that they're realistic and achievable, and can enable us to set higher goals for ourselves in terms of responsible sourcing. And in addition, these standards allow mining entities and also consumer product entities to set goals for ourselves and also measure our performance against those goals, and to be transparent with the public. This can also increase mining companies' access to markets as we become, as consumer companies, more sophisticated in sourcing upstream through the use of the technology that I mentioned. And it also can improve access to investment financing, as I'm sure Sheila and Lana and Wendy, you know of several instances where companies have been unable to get financing for their products and projects due to local community outcry and the lack of this collaboration that should have occurred. An additional perspective, strictly from the consumer side, is that as we, mining is just super complex. I can speak from my own personal experience because I used to work with mining companies in the past, but it's super complex. The regular consumer is just simply not going to be able to spend the time and the effort to really trace the supply chain and have a full understanding of what the ramifications are. So for consumer companies, it's super important that as mining entities and communities and indigenous peoples just engage in this dialogue against and create standards, that there's also branding so that our consumers have that branding awareness and education so that they can select their goods and services appropriately according to these standards. So I think these standards and seals of approval, if you will, are also super valuable for sourcing experts as well. So I think we have a ways to go, but I also feel that the market and the investment community are poised to enter into these dialogues.
Thanks very much, Joan, and thanks for drawing a link with what Lana has spoken about as well, and taking us for a ramble through the whole of the mining value chain. That's really important for people to hear about. So we're going to now draw the conversation to a close. So much richness in this discussion. So I'm going to ask each of you for brief closing comments, including any insights that you would like to share that you've heard from the other panel participants. So again, I'll start with you, Sheila, then Joan and Lana.
Thank you very much. Yes, I've learned a lot from listening to both Lana and Joan. When I think about, a parting shot, at least for now, the one thing I wanted to say is this, that there's a lot of public education that is needed. And the public education needs to focus on, first of all, just how intertwined our development trajectory is to mining. When I listen to people who are not in the mining industry, my sense is that people think mining is outside of our lives. On the contrary, mining is in everything we do in our houses and pretty much everything we use in the hospitals, etc., etc. And so we all have a vested interest in responsible mining. And so my sense is this, that the more people understand this interdependency, the more they are likely to take a direct interest in engaging the communities and engaging the corporates and engaging the governments to ensure that each does their part in making sure that the direction that mining takes in every aspect of the industry is one that leaves us better off than otherwise. So my sense is that public education is essential. But I also think, and I take a leaf from Joan's book, this interface between the source, which is the mining industry and everything else in between, and the consumer industry is one that is understated. The truth of the matter is that mining thrives because there is consumption. The truth is also that consumption thrives because there is mining. And bringing these together to a level that none does any harm is critical. And it cannot be done by mining alone, nor can it be done by the consumers alone. And it certainly cannot be done without the facts being put on the table. This, I think, is where the importance of public education comes into being.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks for so beautifully linking development, mining, and the value chain and consumers. Joan.
Well, I have one point that I have been thinking about as I listen to Lana and Sheila, and it's the emphasis on the individual and people. Now, when it comes down to it, we can talk about companies, we can talk about mining entities and communities, but it really comes down to individual people. And we all want to have pride in what we're doing and to do good. But I think in this instance, one of the things that we need to do better at, we can all improve on, is listening. And, if we have a platform, we need to just come together and do a lot of listening to really, and I think it's really critical in mining that can be so geographically and specific on a community level, that we have a growth mindset, that we come to the table open to learning and to be inspired without preconceptions. And like Sheila said, put the facts on the table and to be prepared to ask questions.
Thanks so much, Joan. And Lana, love to hear your final comments, please.
Well, I have to agree with my fellow panelists. I think that education is definitely important. I think that a lot of people who may not have a very favorable opinion about mining are the same very people that rely on mining to in terms of how it might enhance their lives and their lifestyles. But I also think that to Joan's point, it is people. And so how do we bring those people together? And sometimes, the very voices that we want to discount, maybe because they don't really understand mining or they're not as advanced technologically, all of that. So why should we listen to them? Those are our Indigenous people. Surprisingly, they may be more advanced technologically than you may be aware of. But I think that we need to listen to those voices. And it's not just a one-way education about what mining is and what mining does and how it's a significant part of our lives. It's in turn miners being educated about the people that live on the land, how they rely on the land, what are the environmental issues, so that solutions can be developed and that there is a buy-in. That to me is responsible. So I think it's looking at how do we define responsible and what does that really mean? I think that's how we move forward in all of this.
Thank you, Lana, for beautiful closing comments and for sharing with us your perspective, listening and learning. Great message to leave with miners and investors that are watching this panel session. So I'd like to close by saying thank you so much to Lana, Sheila, and Joan, and for sharing your views and your insights and bringing three incredibly diverse and yet interconnected perspectives about people, about education, about the importance of the mining value chain. Thank Thank you so much for your contribution today. And with that, we'll close the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The InfoScope land management system allows you to effectively automate and address areas such as tenement compliance, stakeholder engagement, ground disturbance, environmental obligations, native title, cultural heritage, and land access.
Talk to us today about a comprehensive solution catered to your operations.